It's Radio Free 501c, the podcast of Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm your host, Cecilia Sepp, and we're so excited to be back for season 6 and continue bringing you outstanding ideas and thought leaders and different ways of thinking. So don't forget to subscribe because you're not going to want to miss any of it. This week I'm joined by longtime friend and first-time guest Kim Berry. She's here to have a conversation with us about membership, and yes, it does include component relations if you're curious, so stay tuned. It's September 30th, 2024. Welcome to episode 256. Hey everybody, it's Monday, September 30th. Can you believe it? It's hard to believe, but fall is upon us, and we're heading into the last quarter of 2024. We're here with this week's episode of Radio Free 501c. I'm Cecilia Sepp, your host. I'm the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips Consulting, and I'm a CAE and an ACNP. And thank you all so much for joining us this week. If you have not yet followed or subscribed, please take a moment and do so you don't miss any of our future episodes. Before we dive into our topic and I introduce our guests for the week, I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to our global audience, and thanks again for joining us. This week, we are on a trend this year of first-time guest, and believe it or not, my friend Kim Berry has never been on the podcast before. She reminded me of this, and I was like, why haven't you been on the podcast? And Kim said, you never invited me. And I said, well, please come on, and she did kindly accept this invitation. We're going to have a conversation about membership. Kim, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to say hello to the audience and tell us a little about yourself?
Well, hello, Cecilia, and thank you for the invitation. I am excited to be here. As she said, my name is Kim Berry, and I come to you with, let's just say over 20 years of association experience and leave it at that. You can do the math yourself. And I've spent a lot of years in the component relations as well as in the membership space, and have a lot of experience to share, good, bad, ugly, in that space, and all the things that I've learned, not only about membership, but also about myself and about association. So I'm excited about the conversation.
Oh, I love that point that you just made about learning about yourself, because we do learn a lot about ourselves working, especially with associations. I think any nonprofit, you learn a lot about yourself. But with associations, that's a really unique opportunity to interact with members and build relationships. So, what do you think is the most important thing to keep in mind when you are talking about membership?
And I would go back a little bit and expand on my own experience, because I think it's actually pretty common. Most of us fall into association work because no one told us, when we were going through school and looking for jobs, that this was an actual career path for us to take, unless you had someone in your family or a close friend who actually worked for an association. And I remember my first association, where I worked for almost 10 years. It felt like such a unique experience to work for an organization that was mission driven, and they're really focused on the needs of their members. And so that's the thing that I constantly remind myself and others who are in this space is, remember why you're there and who you are serving. And that really has to be the focus no matter what. And oftentimes you can get bogged down in doing the day-to-day things that we do in membership and lose sight of that. Or we can sometimes lament and complain about that member who's giving us agita about one thing or another, and realizing that that's why we're here. We are there to service them. Now, some of the things they may ask for may seem unreasonable, and they may come at it in a way that you find a little abrasive. But when we're dealing with it on a human aspect, and we realize that they have a certain need and they're coming to us to help serve that need, it makes it a little bit easier to do. And it's hard when sometimes we have to say no, or that we are unable to do the thing that they want us to do. But if you keep your focus on why you were there, and that relates to the mission of the organization and who you serve, which are the members of that organization, it can keep you from kind of straying off into or getting into the weeds about other things.
And you and I were talking about that. I think that's a nice segue. You and I, when we were talking, getting ready for the episode, you mentioned that there was a period of time where nonprofits became very corporate style focused, and you saw that was detrimental. Can you expand on that for us?
Absolutely. And I think you see trends in associations as in any other business, but nonprofit associations are obviously very unique. And I would say maybe about the mid 2000s, you saw kind of a big shift for associations that said, we need to be more corporate minded. We need to behave the way corporations do. And I equate that with they likely didn't have very strong business practices or good infrastructure or processes going on internally, which led them to seeing some losses or spending money where they probably shouldn't spend it, or just not watching the expenses and looking at their long-term goals and those sort of things. So you saw this sort of big shift. And unfortunately, it came at a price where the focus was then taken off of the member. And that's what I mean about it being detrimental, because at the end of the day, you are working for a membership organization. The members are the focus of what you do. So when you all of a sudden place greater emphasis on the corporation, if you will, and lose sight of that, not only will you not be relevant to your members anymore because they see that you are no longer serving them, but long term, you're not necessarily going to be profitable because you have lost touch with your members. So I always say, really make sure you are keeping the focus on the needs of the member and how they evolve, because the members that you had 25, 30 years ago are not the members you have now and will not be the members you have in 10 years. So you always have to be focused on who your members are in that moment and how you are going to meet the needs of them as they progress through their profession or within the industry. And so I think there is a balance. Absolutely, you should have sound financial practices within your organization and look at how that is changing in the corporate world and how that impacts the nonprofit association. But never, ever lose sight that you are a membership organization, because it will be at your own peril, in my opinion.
I agree with that opinion. I share that opinion wholeheartedly. Like you, I've been in the business for, 20 something years, a little bit. Yes, I'm a woman of a certain age, as the French say. But I love it because, it's like, it's one of my favorite sayings, age and experience will always overcome youth and enthusiasm. There's a reason that we get older because we get to learn things. And one of the things we learn is that we need that focus. We need to focus on the member experience. And we talk about that a lot. I think it does tend to get swept aside. We've all told that joke. All of us who ever worked on staff told that joke about, I could get so much work done if it weren't for these pesky members. Because, we are trying to get through our day. We're trying to get through our task list or hit that deadline, make sure that conference is outstanding. But then the members call and they need us, and we need to provide what they need, because that is why we're here. And that's why nonprofit is so unique and contributes so much to society overall. Everything we do contributes, or should contribute, to make society better. Because I know out there in the audience, there's going to be people say, well, there's nonprofits that are really bad. And yeah, but let's focus on how they could be better. I love it when members call and ask questions, want stuff, ask, maybe they get a little angry because it shows they care most of the time. Like you, I also have a component relations background. And they're the people who care. The people who don't call you, they just don't care. Okay. So don't worry about them so much. But I want to get your reaction. You mentioned how things got to be too much of a corporate focus at one point. I want to get your reaction to what happened during the lockdown. So the 2020 lockdown, and boards started to panic. They started to sweat a little bit. They don't want to be the board that spent the reserve fund. So entire membership departments were wiped out. They laid people off and they said, this is an IT thing. And it's where I developed the idea for our occasional series, the Nonprofit Executive Spotlight, which you were a wonderful first guest on that series. So when that happened, when you saw that happening, what was your reaction?
It was really interesting because I was actually caught in the thick of it. I was laid off from my job in February of 2020, not knowing lockdown was around the corner in the next month. But that gave me a unique perspective because I was in the job market at that time. And what I started to see were a lot of interesting titles.
Mhm.
And it was driven by the need of consolidating positions as well as trying to react to the situation that we were in and how do we kind of survive in this mode because no one knew how long it was going to last.
Mm-hmm.
What I saw, especially in the membership space, as you pointed out, was that a lot of them were wiped out or they were behind. They were looking for membership and marketing people, membership and communications people, membership in IT. So they wanted someone to have expertise in a lot of areas and not just membership. And so they were aligning them and giving them kind of strange titles that made it look fresh and hip and all of these other things. And so, that's not to say that when any organization is confronted with crisis, it forces you to look inward about how you're structured and how you're meeting certain needs. So that's a fair thing to do, but to discount and diminish membership for a membership organization, again, that goes along with that corporate shift of saying, "Oh gosh, we got to react. We got to place more emphasis on our digital infrastructure." Where maybe you should have had that emphasis all along, and you didn't do that. But instead, you just again associations. And I can only say that because I haven't ever really worked in the corporate space. We tend to be very reactionary as opposed to forward thinking and planning for eventualities, because there's always going to be a disruptor of some sort that happens in the country. And so you don't have to know exactly what that disruption is going to be, but reserves are there for a reason. They are there for not only reinvesting in your organization, because that's part of what reserves should be used for, but also when you are in crisis so that you don't have to upend everything. But you're absolutely right. Associations are very reluctant to dig into those reserves.
That's
and
right.
quite often I've seen places where they've reached the capacity of their reserves. They're putting money on top of it and they're not doing anything with it. And they're watching their membership numbers diminish year after year because they're not meeting those needs. They're not creating those products and resources and all those things that are needed to sustain their membership. But they're just hoarding the money that they will never use because rainy days have come and gone and they've never opened the umbrella.
And that's where that is so well said. Thank you. That is exactly, I think, what happens and the mindset. I also think the elimination of membership departments and membership staff shows a lack of understanding in the C-suite about why you're there. The chief staff executive's job is to serve members. They work with the board, but they're there to actually serve the membership. And the board answers to the membership in a lot of ways. So I think that's really a sign that you don't really understand that member relations is not the same thing as the database, because they're not. And I've seen other organizations do that well before the lockdown. And even then I thought it was a huge mistake. I mean, it's always a huge mistake because your members are their relationships, they're not data. Although we do love to churn through our data, don't we? We love that.
Oh, I love data. Data informs you about where things are and how they're trending. So I'm a data person. I use that to help inform me.
Mm-hmm.
That said, when you talk about the disconnect between the board and sometimes the C-suite and the importance of membership. So one of the things you brought up was like the database, that membership is not just the database. But I also think one of the things that tends to happen is that membership is left out of conversations.
Yep.
When it relates to programs, services, and technology that impact the member. They think, well, it's not a membership thing, it's a tech thing. So we don't need to talk to membership, but what tech is doing impacts membership. It impacts the member, it impacts the experience. If you are building programs in education and you're not talking to membership, who tends to be the front line with the member, you're missing an opportunity. So that's one of the other things that I see sadly in a lot of associations, in that the membership team is often excluded or an afterthought in some of these discussions about things that impact the member, or that we might have some wisdom to offer before they move into this space to say, well, have you considered X, Y, and Z? Because let's face it, often the people, let's say in particular in IT, they're not touching the members. They're just looking at it from a purely, how does this function kind of a thing.
Right.
But not understanding necessarily how the member might actually be using it. And so that's, if you don't include membership in that conversation, you're often missing it. My previous association, I happened to start right when they were going through the RFP process for getting a new AMS. And what they did right was include the entire staff and talk about what are your pain points with the current system, what do you need to have happen. But membership was a large driver in how that was going to work and what was needed, because we understood, because we are the power users of that database, not IT, not education, not business development. Membership is in there more than anything else, but often they're the ones, in some instances, who are excluded the most when those decisions are made. And so I do think when you talk about disconnect, I often think about how can I, as an individual, do a better job of communicating the importance of membership to the C-suite or to the board. Because often the board, we all know, we've had this discussion that board members are made up of those people who have given service to the organization, and this is their ultimate reward, is to serve on the board. Whether or not they have any real capacity and understand the responsibility of being on the board of a nonprofit association, and not to their fault. I mean, if you're a nurse, you're in the trenches as a nurse. You're not necessarily concerned about how does this organization need to run.
Right.
You think your purpose there is to give insight on the profession. And that is not necessarily why you're there as a board member.
Right.
That's what the member. And so you do have this disconnect. If the board doesn't understand it, then how are they properly guiding the mission of the organization when they haven't been properly trained to do that? Or they think they have a different directive and they haven't been told otherwise.
Well, and that, that is something of a Pandora's box of educating the board. And the reason I say that is because, if for those in the audience not familiar with the story of Pandora's box, it was a box that Pandora was given and told never to open it. So of course she did, because who wouldn't? Because she was cursed with curiosity. And so when she opened the box, she let all of the 7 deadly sins out into the world. But at the bottom of the box was hope. And so that's the story of Pandora's box. And that's why it's kind of a Pandora's box to talk about board education, in my opinion, because we talk about it, we try to do it.
We do try.
But if you don't have a receptive board who wants to be educated, who wants to learn, who wants to know what their real job is, then that's a problem, because then hope gets stuck in the bottom of the box.
And the attention gets diverted to things that have zero to do with the mission of the organization. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've worked for organizations where the tradition was to take on whatever the pet project of the incoming chair. Didn't matter if it didn't have anything to do. So we're going to do a charity event at the Children's Hospital because this is what the board chair thinks is important. And no one ever steps up to ask the question, what does this have to do with advancing the mission of this organization? It's a great thing, fine. But now you're going to take time, staff resources, financial resources away from our mission and divert it to this particular endeavor. And so that's not necessarily, a good thing to do. I mean, that's I would say, an extreme example, but not uncommon. But at the same time, it's what can we all do to make sure that the board is well informed? One of the things I had put out even at a former association is, at these board meetings, can we have presentations by each department, maybe for every meeting, because you can't fit it all in for one board meeting, to kind of give them an understanding of what happens in this department. So if it's education, it's kind of giving them a window into what the education department does, how they work to serve the needs of the member. It could be membership. It could even be IT. It could be the finance folks. I feel like the finance folks have a lot more time with the board just because of the financial aspect than probably anybody else. But I think it's important in building not just knowledge, but empathy. I mean, I often said cross-training should always be done at every organization so people spend a minute in someone else's shoes, because it's really easy to say, I don't know what that person does. I don't think they do anything, because you have no idea what they do. And I think that's where membership falls. I think they think we are just processing applications and, pulling reports and talking to members on the phone, and that their membership, a well-run membership team, that person has to be strategic. They have to have the empathy. They have to build a plan. Membership probably integrates more with all the other departments in an organization than anyone else. Yet I find that the respect for that particular profession within associations isn't that strong unless, which is another dangerous thing, membership makes up more than 50% of the revenue for the organization. And even then, you find that advocacy, which brings in value some, but not revenue, they tend to be at the top of the pyramid for a lot of organizations. And membership is at the bottom in the trenches.
Well,
and we're being in the trenches.
That is such a good point about membership being overlooked like that, because I've been a membership director and a chapter relations director. And in both situations, I have been overlooked, especially chapter relations, which is a huge part of membership. If you have chapters or special interest groups, that's how the members get to participate. It's really important to have a strong program. Exactly. The ground up. But do you know, at one job I had where I was a chapter relations director, I was basically told by my fellow staff members that I was nothing more than a glad hander. My response was, well, you remember that the next time you need help with something, because this group that I'm working with can make things happen and get things done. And a lot of that you mentioned earlier, you think is really important for cross training. I'm a big believer in that cross-functional training, understand how the pieces fit together. And at that particular organization where I was a chapter relations director, the staff had no idea that I was even an employee. They thought I was running an office, because it was actually a board of governors and a medical association. And so the person who had the job before me worked in complete isolation, did whatever the heck she wanted, didn't talk to anybody. In an era when we didn't work from home, she just refused to come to the office. She would just stay at home and work, and she took all the files with her. So when I started, all the file cabinets were empty and nobody knew what I was supposed to do. So I was like, okay. And so, but over time, I was able to, talk with people, communicate, educate, show them how we could work together, show how what I was doing with the Board of Governors was important to the health of the organization and actually could be beneficial to the other departments, and was able to reintegrate them back into the overall structure and systems. And people said that after I'd been there for a while, oh, wow, you've really done a good job doing that, because we really had no idea, what it was. And I think
so critical.
Yeah. And oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, when I worked for an organization where I was the senior manager of affiliate relations, and that organization had 170 state and local affiliates. And I was a team of one. So that's fun. And so part of that was making sure that, every year they signed the agreement about affiliation because they were independently affiliated. There was providing professional development for our affiliate leaders to make sure that they were staying up on what it is they need to do. It's introducing them to all the products and services and also understanding the infrastructure and the relationship between that affiliate and the national organization. And we did, one of the things I pushed for was a new affiliate executive orientation, because the new folks coming in, they're trying to learn their job and they're trying to also figure out what's this relationship here with the national organization. And so putting that in place so that they can understand the relationship. And I really pushed for this to be in person at the time. And it took me about 2 years because I kept saying, make it virtual. I said, these people have jobs to do. They're busy. They're not going to focus unless we actually bring them in. So after 2 years of pestering, they finally said, okay, we're going to do it. And I think the program still exists to this day, long after we were actually able to get sponsorship for it, to help offset the cost, because we would bring them in. For those who didn't have a lot of money, we paid for their airfare and their hotel. And one of the things we would have staff sort of give those presentations I was talking about to say what it is, what they do. And I direct them, I said, what you must do is tell them why what you do is important to them and their members. So before you come in and just say, hey, we're a part of the advocacy team and this is what we do, tell them why it matters. And so I think, again, if we're talking about disconnects with boards, maybe it's because we as staff haven't done a great job of saying this is what we do and this is why it matters. And so I can spend all day talking about, sort of deficiencies in the things that I've observed in my 20 plus years, but I also want to offer some suggestions about how we can address some of these issues, how we can be more cohesive as an organization that is a membership organization, still have those wonderful financial practices built in that I spent a lot of time with chapters and affiliates trying to get them to incorporate good financial practices. There were some that didn't even have a budget. That was fun. But yeah, just really, making sure when you're the most successful organizations are the ones that I think are the most cohesive and have also embraced membership as really that center pin in that wheel, and saying that that's where everything else comes from. If you don't have a strong membership infrastructure, doesn't matter what IT does, doesn't matter what education does, because at the end of the day, we are all working for the member. And we just, again, don't lose sight of why you're there, the mission, and who you were there to serve, which is the member.
That's an excellent point and well said again. Thank you. That's wonderful. So I'm going to ask you one more question before we wrap up. You mentioned earlier about boards not using reserve funds, even though that's what they're for in crisis, or if you need to do a special project. Chapters tend to sit on their money too. And I find that actually a little more offensive than board sitting on reserve funds. So what's been your experience with that? And what is your opinion on chapter sitting on their money?
And it's a little complicated because I think it depends on the chapter structure. Because again, if you're an independently incorporated organization, but you're a chapter of a larger organization, they will remind you on a regular basis that they are independent and national can't tell them what to do and how to do it. And ultimately, though, they will come to national to help bail them out of a situation financially when they find themselves in trouble, without fail, across the board. And I think this also goes back to, but if you are under the umbrella of the national organizations, then certainly the national can set standards about how you use your funds, because they basically have control over those funds. So it might be a little bit different in that regard. But let's look at the independent model. I think that goes back to consistent training. We can't enforce it at the end of the day, but we can also show them examples of those chapters who are succeeding, that are growing, and those practices that they have incorporated and saying, okay, now I'm looking at you're sitting on this money, but you're watching your membership levels dwindle. You're watching your engagement levels dwindle. And it's because you're not reinvesting into your organization. And so, it's pretty clear. So you can do these things and grow and expand, or you can stay where you are and you will eventually have to dissolve. And guess what? You got to give that money back to their members when you dissolve.
That's right. Well, see, and that's especially with a subordinate chapter. And okay, folks, save the angry postcards. It's not an assault to call somebody a subordinate part of an organization. It just means they're part of the organization.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we take affiliates out of the mix, because they basically should have their own money and they shouldn't be coming back to you, the national group, and saying, bail us out. But when you're looking at the subordinate chapters, and like you, I've worked with all different systems. When they're getting rebate money, let's say, or they're getting some sort of support from national as a subordinate chapter, that money's being given to them to use, not to put in the bank and sit on it. And it's why we ask them to do the financial reports and let us know what they're doing with the money. And it's my opinion in this era, as you may know, Kim, you and I talk a lot about what's going on in the association profession. And I've been actually beating the drum about, I love chapters, but the way we've done things needs to change. And I think that's one of the things that seriously needs to change, is take that money back from them. It's not theirs. It actually belongs to the National Association in a subordinate situation. Take that money back and then use that money in a fund to help them do things. Don't make them manage the money for them. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think that would be in a perfect world. I think the real world is when you even have subordinate chapters, often the national office doesn't put the support in place to manage it effectively. So that's why what you're talking about tends to happen, because nobody's really watching. Yeah, when the reporting comes in, you can see, hey, chapter A they have money in their coffers, it keeps increasing, they're not doing anything with it. But there's no one on staff that says, I'm going to manage how these funds are being spent. There might be one, maybe two people on staff, and they're all trying to deal with different issues that the chapters have. And that tends to not be one of those things. So I think if you're going to put that type of process in place, it requires a certain amount of staff support to manage it well. Outside of that, I do think there is a certain amount of training, because again, just like with national staff, chapter staff turns over, especially if you're all volunteer. And so it's on that hamster wheel, chasing that tail of trying to get that next person set up to be an effective financial manager, as well as that membership person. So, but I think that goes back to, is the structure well managed? Should it be that those subordinate chapters are managed by national staff? But can you do that well without getting someone who's not local, who doesn't understand the members in that area? So there are a lot of components to that. I have seen with my former association, they started hiring regional vice presidents to sort of manage the chapters in that region, which I think became a little bit more efficient. They couldn't do one for every chapter. If they had over 170, don't have the staff for that, but they would put these regional persons in place who are going to look at all of the chapters or affiliates in that region and try to be more responsive to their needs and watching what they're doing and making sure they're in compliance with the guidelines that are set. And that's the other thing too. What kind of guidelines are you setting for your chapters or affiliates that are clear and concise and that they have the tools to follow them? So it's one thing to say, okay, I wish they did all of this stuff, X, Y, and Z, but if you don't give them the proper tools to do it, it's another thing. So I think it's a complex issue to not just say, well, yeah, the structure isn't working. We kind of know that. But what is the best structure when you have a national membership, and how do you serve their needs locally or regionally?
That's right. And that would be a great topic to have you come back and talk about.
And we could have a round table with a bunch of people who do component relations to talk about all of those issues, because I think there are a lot of different perspectives on that. Like I said, I work for federations where they're all independent. I work for some that chapters you still had to join the chapter first in order to be part of national. And then there was sort of a top-down approach. Hey, you join national and we'll assign you to a chapter. And they all have inherent flaws.
Yeah, they do. They do.
They do.
But I think that's where we need to have some clearer understanding of what these different things are, because, a subordinate chapter is very different than a federation. And
Very
federations, if you're a federation, like I think AHCA is a really great example of that, because they're a real federation. It only exists because all the state groups exist, and they are the members of that federation. So that's really not like a chapter situation. What I'd also like to see when it comes to chapters, no matter what kind of structure you have, that people lose the negativity about dealing with chapters. Because one of the things I hear all the time when I check in, like with the ASAE component relations, and the conversation's always, I can't control them. They won't do what I tell them. The attorney's always talking about liability issues. And it's like, we're putting obstacles in the way of solving the problem.
Well, and you're also getting away from why you're there and who you serve. And this is just at a micro level and not a macro level. And so you really need to put those things in place. And sometimes there's a shift in the structure. What if you started off as independent and you went to a subordinate, and then you got to deal with the culture shock of moving in that space and what's involved with that? So that's a whole different conversation too. Like, how do you manage that change?
Yeah, exactly.
And what tends to happen is you have folks who disaffiliate. So like, no, I don't want to be under that structure. I want to still be able to do what I do when I do it, how I do it. Doesn't matter if they were successful or not, but that's just kind of the thing that you run into. So there's so many conversations within the component relations space that we could have conversations about, and sort of what is the best model, or is there just one best model for every organization? Or how do you incorporate some very successful practices into your model and say, this is how to make your model more efficient, as opposed to saying, this is the way everybody should do it, because it may or may not work for your structure. But you're right, the federation, my first federation, they were quick to remind you, you exist because we are here.
That's right.
And if you know, and it was interesting because, and I can say in particular, without naming the association, but geographically, they paid dues, the chapter affiliates paid dues to national based on a formula. But the largest affiliate was in Texas, and they had 25 locals under the state. And so that was a tail wagging the dog. So whenever Texas didn't like something that National was doing, guess what? National didn't do it, because they provided a third of the revenue that the organization collected. And so that is a little bit of the downside of that structure, is that, and you can't help it, because a lot of national associations got started by a collection of chapters. Then they may have decided to become under a subordinate structure, but the reason most national associations exist was because they were grown out of local entities. Yeah. And so how do you honor that and respect that, but still put a structure in place that is not just successful out of the gate, but is sustainably successful? Especially when you have a difference between, like the Texas State Association, their staff was as large, if not larger, than the national. But then you had a whole bunch of them that were volunteer-led and said, I don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to do X, Y, and Z. And by the way, you saw that they had the same chapter president year after year after year, because nobody else wanted to do it. So, like I said, there are so many issues that rabbit holes we can go down when we talk about chapter or component relations. It's fascinating, actually.
Yeah, it really is. And to your point, there's very different structures, and I don't think one is better than the other necessarily. But what I see is a lack of understanding of the differences and a lack of understanding of language. So like I hear people use chapter and affiliate interchangeably, and that's not
They're not the
accurate.
same.
They're not the same thing. So it's like I worked with a client a couple years ago, and they had affiliates, not chapters, but they were calling them chapters. When I explained the difference, she said, you're right. We're going to start calling them affiliated chapters because we've already started using that chapter language. So we're just going to add that. And I think that's a great way to respond to that. But it is.
And also, guess what? The leadership doesn't know the difference either. And I think sometimes their understanding, even within the organization, is skewed because again, they use chapter the way we talk about Phoenix, and they think it's just all the same. And there's so many differences and nuances with every structure, and understanding that I think helps. I think it actually helps even with membership because again, if it's a ground up membership kind of a deal,
right?
I remember I worked for one place, we had state affiliates, but there was no membership requirement. So you could be a member of both at your choosing. You could be a member of just the National Association, or you could be just a member of the state. And it kind of went a third. So there were members of both, and then you had a third each that were members of one or the other, which was interesting too. And so they had an affiliate agreement on how they were aligned with the National Association governance. Had nothing to do with their ability to get members or whatnot. So that was very different than when I was under the federated structure, even though they were both affiliates.
Right.
But then I had a chapter one that was interesting because they called them chapters, but they were still independent. But there was a membership relationship, a binding membership relationship,
right?
Between the two. So much to unpack with that.
Yeah, there really is, and as you and I have both mentioned, we've seen most of it, if not all of it. So, well, I think we could go on, but we can't because all good things must come to an end. Unfortunately, Kim, has been great having you on here, talking about membership, talking about component relations because they're so intertwined. But as we're wrapping up, I always like to ask my guests, what's the one thought you would like the audience to take away today? And then how can they get in touch with you if they'd like to connect?
I think we talked a lot about some of the challenges we have in the membership space and in the component relation space. But at the end of the day, membership is about relationships. And so if you are passionate about forming and maintaining relationships with individuals, the nonprofit association space could be a really good space for you. If you are passionate about working for an organization that has a mission that is aligned with your personal values, associations might be a really good space for you. And that's really what attracted me to being in the association space. And I would just say it's a passion. It might be something that you fall into, but you stay there because you have a passion about, you have a servant leader attitude that you want to serve folks. And so those are the things to think about. And it has nothing to do with being introverted or extroverted. You could be an introvert and still have a passion for serving members. Just your approach might be a little bit different. So don't let that be a hindrance either. And I would just say, it just really has to be a passion of yours to do well in this space. It's not for the softer part because a lot of what you do is in addressing challenges, but it can also be rewarding to when you know that you've helped someone. It also could be rewarding when you work for an association or an organization that is doing good in the world. So that kind of balances some of the pain points that you might encounter, throughout your day or throughout your year. So that's what I want people to really think about, that I'm here because I want to be in this space. I'm excited about being in this space. It's where I want to be. And if you want to connect with me and continue the conversation, you can find me on LinkedIn, Kimberly C. Berry. I believe that's what it is. And I have to spell my name out for you just so you can find me easily. It's Kimberly, spelled Kimberlee, Berry, Berry. Would love to connect with you and continue the conversation.
That's great. And I know we'll continue our conversation outside of the podcast, but I know you'll be back. So I'm looking forward to that.
Wonderful. It's so great talking with you, Cecilia.
Oh, thank you, Kim. You too. So, well, we well-experienced association professionals need to go rogue for now, but we'll be back next week with another exciting episode. So again, gentle reminder, if you haven't followed us or subscribed yet, please do on your favorite podcast service. We're on all the major ones, so I'm sure you can find us. If you would like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting and how we can help your organization bloom outside the box and think differently, check out our website, roguetulips.com. If you would like to have a conversation about if we would be a good fit to work with you, always up for that. If I'm not the right person, I'll send you in the right direction. If you are a nonprofit management professional and you're getting ready for the CAE exam, we offer study groups and courses. You can find those on our Rogue Tulips education page at the website. We also offer our ethics course, which is one of the best ones out there, every month. So check out the website if you want to learn more about ethics, and especially if you need that ethics renewal credit for the CAE renewal process. So that's it for this week. On behalf of Kim and myself, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.